All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone feeling after lunch, after the coffee? Good? It's been a very exciting day, to be thinking about Venezuela. I'm really excited to be sharing a little bit more about school finance. I had the great honor of having Maria Corina explain a lot of this, so my job will be a little easier, hopefully. But today we'll go through the current state of Venezuela's education system, which I think we've heard bits and pieces of. We'll then go through why finance is so important and such an overlooked lever in education policy making. And lastly, what our proposal will be. I think this is the most important part that I'd love to spend a little bit more time on. So we've seen that it's a system in just complete collapse. 1.5 million students are out of school. 200,000 teachers are not teaching anymore because of the migration and economic crisis. Teachers are being paid $192. This is at most, considering bonuses, but their monthly base pay is actually now $2. And so this is a very, very low amount as compared to, it's like only a third of what they would need to actually pay for food every month. And because of the mosaic schedule, kids are going to school for maybe 3 days because there's not enough teachers, there's not enough infrastructure and resources to fit all of them. This is all on top of very severe learning losses where they're not meeting grade level standards in math and language and very severe infrastructure decay. So the picture is bleak, and there's something that's why we're here. That's something that we want to do something about. The other side of this, and of course for a school finance chapter, is the funding. If we're looking at the spending per student across in Venezuela, it's only a ninth of what other Latin American countries are spending on average, and only a 54th of what OECD countries are spending on average, which is a tremendous funding gap to really see quality in education. Another key statistic here is what I asked Maria Corina, 1.3%. Only 1.3% of public expenditure is spent on education. And while it's not just a quantity number, it is still the fiscal base for all of these fantastic proposals we've heard today. And so I'm really interested in seeing this number increase over time because on average, you're recommended to spend at least 6%, and the world average is 3.66%. On the other side, beyond the funding constraints, there's also a lack of opacity and transparency over how the funds are used. And so we know that modern school finance systems need both the adequacy of resources, but also the transparency and the efficiency of those of resources. And that's not what we're seeing now. Venezuela ranks very low on the transparency index. They haven't participated in any national assessments. We are seeing a volatile budget between 10 to 20% throughout the year. So it's an inconsistent priority. And there's no data to support all of this that's publicly accessible. So it's very hard to understand what's happening right now. Now, finance is such a key lever, and if we think about what a school finance system needs to succeed and to really drive quality, there are these 4 kind of components. The first is that of adequacy, so sufficient money being mobilized to the right causes. The second is equitable distribution, and so making sure that the funds that we do have are distributed equitably throughout the system. The third is making sure that the resources are used efficiently and that whatever we're planning is executed well. And lastly, that there's a way to have monitoring and oversight over all of the resources that we're putting into education. We can learn a lot of lessons from the region. I think Maria Corina herself mentioned that we want Venezuela to be a laboratory, and we want to do this in Venezuelan ways. So this is not to say that we're doing exactly what Chile, Colombia, and Brazil are doing, but more of drawing and learning from their best practices. So Chile they had their own voucher journey, starting with a general voucher and moving towards one with more differentiation for priority students and for those with vulnerable backgrounds. And that was actually very successful in seeing academic improvements as well as expanded access and enrollment. This is all anchored in a very strong monitoring system, which I'll go into later, but because the state is shifting from the role of a provider to a quality assurance kind of actor, it's so important to have really strong assessments. And that's what we're also seeing in Colombia, where they have very strong national testing through SABRE and very strong audits and supports to schools that are not performing as well to ensure that quality continues. Brazil, likewise, also has a very extensive formula for distributing funds to different schools based on students, based on performance, based on morality, and they're seeing that has improved enrollment, and also it's all anchored in a really great quality assurance mechanism. And so this is what we're hoping to draw and take pieces from as we put together the proposal for Venezuela. So what does that proposal entail? There are 4 main elements to this. The first is a dual financing system. The second is establishing the IVCE, or the Venezuelan Institute for Educational Quality. The third is designing a full and robust accountability and evaluation system. And lastly, introducing an education management information system, which is a technical backbone of everything that we're discussing today. This first component consists of two things. The first is a per-student voucher. And as we said, this is where money follows the student rather than just being put to different institutions. In the context of recovering from democracy, having choice is so important because we want choice in terms of the values and the principles of the schools. We want choices in terms of quality and making sure that the families with the least resources can still access very high-quality education. We intend to design this voucher in a way that has many safeguards for eligibility. And again, because financing is such a strong instrument, when money follows the student, we can attach many kinds of standards and rules for that money to be shared with schools. And so this includes participating in national assessments, not having admission screening, no fees for priority students, and many others. And we're hoping that this can be something that we pilot in several states first before we scale nationally. Now, recognizing that per-student vouchers may not be sufficient for some schools with very low attendance, so that's not enough to cover for operational costs and the extent of infrastructure decay in Venezuelan schools, we also propose a targeted regional fund which addresses some of these funding gaps. And it goes direct to schools, it's not tied to attendance, and it considers rurality, infrastructure decay, as well as the regional poverty levels. So this is the first, and I would say the most core component that, again, promotes choice and ensures that there's an incentive to innovate for high-quality education because we're tying a lot of these funding release to the quality and performance of schools. Now, how do we make sure that quality is being followed within the system? That's through the Venezuelan Institute for Educational Quality. This is an independent technical agency that's designed to set the standards of performance, that actually reports and evaluates results, and it coordinates within a new redesigned governance ecosystem consisting of the Education Council, the actual ministry, the superintendency, the local public education agencies, and public and private providers. And these are not institutions that exist in this way that we imagine it right now, but we imagine that this is essential when it comes to a more quality-oriented education system. The third component is a more comprehensive accountability and evaluation system consisting of a standard setting process, actual performance evaluations, audits of institutions, communicating results publicly. I think Maria Corina also mentioned public and honest communication of results, ensuring that schools are actually eligible for the financing, which means submitting their monthly attendance reports, developing educational improvement plans, and also financial reports. And lastly, having a school classification system, which means that we can learn from the best schools and also support the schools that are underperforming. The last component, which I mentioned is the technical backbone for this whole system, is really strong data. Because if we don't know what kids are scoring, how much funds schools have received, we don't know their attendance, there's no way for us to run this whole system. And so EMIS, or an Education Management Information System, is key. And this will consist of data related to the students, to the schools, to attendance, other financial records, and lastly, the learning outcomes. All of this is essential for how we see Venezuela's education recovery moving forward, going from collapse to opportunity, and we can't overlook the role of finance in this. I think for all the policymakers in the room, we hope that you join us in conducting the research and evaluating the best practices, designing the structure and going into the details of this policy to ensure that it really achieves what we're looking for. For all the school providers, the communities, you are part of the new plurality of options and diversity of options for students in Venezuela and families to choose where to send their children. And international partners play a very important role in financing this, in joining us in reviewing best practices. Also, that because every Venezuelan child deserves access to high quality, politically neutral education, and how we finance schools will decide whether that promise becomes real. So I hope that this has been a short but really packed overview of everything that there is that we're thinking about in the Venezuelan education system. And I'm sure that our panelists later will have a lot to say about what we've designed in terms of what's worked in other regions, in terms of what needs to be adapted for Venezuela's context and recovery. But I hope this gives you hope and encourages you to think about what's concrete and what needs to happen to ensure that everything that we've talked about today, from teachers to the curriculum content, all is actually possible and actually has impact on students. So with that, I'll close, and I'll make sure that we have enough time for a very provocative discussion, I'm sure. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. So for our panel, and what I've been told will be a very exciting discussion, we have Asim Khwaja, who's a professor at HGSE, Callysta, and then we have Patrick McEwan, who's the Goldman professor at Wellesley College. And moderating this discussion will be Maria Renée Palomo, an alumni of the Harvard Graduate Education School. So I'm super excited for this conversation, and I'll pass it off to our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists. I'm going to start with Patrick McEwan. He is Marshall Goldman Professor of Economics, not far away from here at Wellesley College. His work focuses on education and social policy in developing countries, particularly in Latin America, with an emphasis on identifying the causal impact of policies on children's schooling, health, and economic outcomes. He holds a PhD in education from another university, Stanford. Previously, his research has examined the effects of conditional cash transfers and school reform in Honduras, youth orchestras in Venezuela, and education policies such as school vouchers and free meals in Chile. His work centers on evaluating policy interventions that shape human capital development and has been published in leading economic journals. Thank you, Patrick, for being here. Our second speaker is Asim Khwaja. He is director of the Center for International Development here at the Harvard Kennedy School and also professor of international finance and development at HGSE. His work focuses on economic development, finance, education, and political economy, combining rigorous empirical research with policy engagement. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University and dual bachelor's degree in economics and mathematics with computer science from MIT. He co-founded the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, and his research centers on market failures in financial systems and the role of private education in low-income countries with a focus on informing effective policy solutions. Thank you, Asim, for being here. I'm going to start with a very broad question for both of our panelists, and please also, Callysta, don't hesitate to intervene. So the proposal we heard is built on the assumption that if you get the financing architecture right, that means the voucher design, the regional fund, the accountability system, quality will follow. As education finance experts, how much can financing mechanisms actually do on their own in a context like Venezuela? And what has to be built first before the money can work? Patrick, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. My strategy is going to be, I think, to talk about one of the most boring things on the slide, information systems. But I think we've all, as citizens, as technical people working in these fields, we've seen many of these reforms that were good ideas on paper with a nice formula. We've seen them fail because formulas are a complement to, but not a substitute for, institutional capacity. And when you have a formula, a voucher system potentially in place, there will be lots of forces arrayed against it. Elites might not favor it because they don't like programmatic resource distribution. They like clientelist and political resource distribution. Bureaucracies might not have the capacity or the information to implement it, and citizens may not trust it, a word that's come up a number of times today. And so I think sequencing matters a lot. What are the conditions that need to be in place for this policy to have a prayer of succeeding? Sequencing has come up a lot today. I'll just mention briefly information, and I'll do it in an applied context. I've spent most of my career in Chile, and I started going there in the mid-90s, which was right after an authoritarian regime. In fact, there was still a Senador Vitalicio Pinochet, so there is an ominous sense in which there is not quite a democracy yet. And so there is things that needed to be done quickly, and they required information. And so one of the first things that happened was that given the CIMSE test scores that already existed, they used them to target essentially an emergency teaching at the right level program. I would call it the original teaching at the right level, Programa de los 900 Escuelas, P900. Okay, and that was information-based. It would have been impossible without good test scores. HUNAIB, that's come up, had a vulnerability survey that with anthropometrics that they used to allocate and assign and deliver high-quality nutritional interventions that are the model for many other countries. And there was a strong payments and accountability system. The most boring thing, but I could go into the ministry and I could see that Aki's school got paid this much for this many kids attending. And that's a non-trivial thing to put in place, but it guaranteed that in a minimal sense, the financing reform worked there. Is it all roses? No, there were lots of things that didn't work. There were ministries collecting overlapping data, missing data, doing policies with the wrong data. But if anyone's been to Chile lately, and I have, you can see what 30 years of sustained effort can do to support a policy like this. It's a paradise of data. I finally tell my Norwegian friends, I've got better data than you because there's a full panel. We could all download it now to know where every child in Chile is attending, including thousands and thousands of Venezuelan children in Chilean schools right now. The same finance system I mentioned, available. The Ministry of Finance gives grants to create data sets across ministries and support social policy evaluation. So that was built with blood, sweat, and tears. I wouldn't do all that first. I would start with some of the basics, though, and that will be a nice topic for conversation.
So just adding to this, first of all, I think it's a huge mistake to think finance is going to do what you want it to do. I think finance can do more harm than good. So just really careful when you use money, especially when you think of the budgetary costs of using money. So, and I think most money usage, unfortunately, has been very distortionary in markets. So we've mostly gotten it wrong. So in my mind, money should always follow, never lead. And so you need to think about what you're leading on. It's never going to be money. It's a mistake. I know people talk about vouchers and it's a political thing. I think it's a huge mistake to kind of start with that. What you want to start in is what is the objective of what you're trying to do. And I think any education system, first of all, you can never design financial systems correctly. You'll always get it wrong. 100%. You name your favorite system, we'll get a long list of all the mistakes you're making. That's not the point. The point is not getting right. The point is having a North Star which isn't money, so that money is constantly changing how you give, when you give, what you give in achieving that North Star. What a system might be right today is going to change tomorrow. In fact, your own successes will have the system change. So then what's your North Star? And this is something you as Venezuelans and those who love Venezuela, I've never been. Emiliana never invites me, and so... you have to decide as a community, as a polity, what you want. We have our own wish list. You have your wish list. I agree with your wish list. I think what you want is two things. You want quality and you want efficiency and equity. So quality, three things. I don't know how to count. And access. Transparency. I don't care about that much. Particularly. As long as it works, I don't need to know the details. No, because more seriously, when you think of quality, look, you don't want to repeat US. US sucks in education. We haven't improved anything in the last 60 years. Don't get lessons from this country. Don't get lessons from Latin America. They're not doing terribly well either. The nice thing about Venezuela is you guys have done so little that you can rebuild everything, which is by the way, there's a blessing in disguise. The less money you spend, I think, is a great thing. That means you can start in a much more creative way. And the first creative thing you should do, Emiliana and I have a paper on this, which is thinking, and this is, Fernando Reimers has talked about this as well, who also is Venezuelan, right? You guys have like a whole mafia over here, don't you? You, Ricardo, I guess it makes sense, right? Because, okay, I won't say anything more and get into trouble. But what I mean is, if you decide what quality is, quality cannot be test scores. If you define quality as only test scores, you're just following other people who made a mistake. You should define quality as test scores, as life skills, as entrepreneurial ability, as empathy. I mean, if you ask me what the biggest skill missing in the world is, not how to invert a matrix. It's whether you have empathy about the other human being. You want Venezuelans to come out and say, we are leaders in the world, not because we do good math or Spanish or English or whatever you want to say, is because we are actually contributors to both our country, your country needs a lot of people like that, and the world. Right, so that means defining quality before you begin anything and measuring quality. You have great test systems, but they're still measuring the usual stuff. Take the infrastructure and have it measure new stuff, and you have expertise everywhere. There's lots of people who'd love to help you with that, right? You don't have to rely on Venezuelans or Venezuelan diasporas to do it. You don't even have to rely on people who speak Spanish. It doesn't matter, right? I have Google Translate. I can talk to all of you. And so once you've done that, once you have a notion of quality, then define affordability. I think it's a mistake when you say vouchers are the way to solve a problem. They're never the way. In fact, most vouchers in basic economics and welfare theorems are actually terrible because they're price distortionary. Anytime you create a price distortion, getting it right is extremely hard, which is why we believe in unconditional transfers. In fact, you don't want parents to be competing or schools to be competing on money. You want schools to be competing on alternative uses of money. So when you give an unconditional cash transfer, if a parent wants to use that money not to send their kid to school and instead send their kid to a vocational training institute or invest in their kid's health or to buy an iPad for their kid, that's a real statement they're saying. They're saying, we don't think your quality is good enough for me to actually enter your system. You want that information, right? Because someone says, oh, you should give conditional cash transfer. Terrible idea. If you give a conditional cash transfer, you're forcing people to only spend it on education. And what if your education is crap? In fact, that's a disservice. If you take someone and put them in a bad school, that's the worst thing you can do to people. You'd rather have that person go work on the street and do a better job and have a better livelihood. So you need to have schools compete for the money you give them on every dimension of using that money. And that'll happen only if you open the field. And I'm not saying money isn't important, but again, it follows. Right? Look, I teach finance. I'm not going to say, but most of my finance friends would say if you think of finance as a way to solve your problems, huge mistake. You solve your problems by knowing what your problem is and focusing on it. And so that's going to be kind of, I'll stop over here, but, and then affordability, sorry, I should say one thing. Once you have quality in this broad way, then the only thing you need to think about is affordability. And that's a different thing. And affordability is you want every single talented kid in Venezuela to have the opportunities to shine. Doesn't matter who they are, doesn't matter whether the opposition leader's kid, does she have kids? Yes, or... Oh, good. So clearly quality is already achieved. Or a poor person living in your slum areas, or I know you're urban and rural, or someone in a rural area. Everyone should be affording education, but that does not mean they need to be paid money. That just means you need to make it somehow accessible to them. And there are lots of ways of doing so. But if you keep affordability and quality in mind, you will come up with the right financial constructs to achieve that. You will need some financial constructs, but that follows this. And I said they'll change over time as well. So I'm here to stop.
Thank you so much. You both shared how important information is, and you, Asim, shared about defining quality and affordability. And Asim, I'm going to continue with a question for you. With all the work you've done in Pakistan, showing that financing works as a quality lever only when competitive market dynamics already exist, what conditions need to be in place in Venezuela before a financing mechanism can work? And what would you prioritize building first before scaling the voucher? Although you already answered about defining quality, defining affordability better.
So you're right. So I tend to be accused as a market guy in education because a lot of my work is looking at non-public responses to education. I'm actually not. I'm a systems person. My view is that you should allow multiple providers to exist in education. Public, private, and non-profit. We often don't talk about non-profit providers as much as we should. They all have a role to play. Non-profit providers, by the way, are the most innovative, by far. We think of private sector as innovative. It's a huge mistake. Silicon Valley is not innovative. It just has lots of money because there are people who are connected enough to get money. The biggest innovators are non-profits for a very simple reason. Non-profit leaders never respond to the market. They couldn't care less. They're funded by must be lots of rich Venezuelans, right? They're funded by philanthropists, and that's beautiful. Because they do whatever the heck they want to. And you want someone like that. The private sector is great for scale. The public sector is great for access. Okay? So when you think of a system of education, then you have to ask yourself, what is the degree of competition? I actually think there's always competition. We define competition when we think it's like some, I don't know, Apple competing with Samsung. That's, there's even competition. Think of what I would define it broadly. Even if you have a single school in a community, no other choice, there's still competition. Because there's competition of going to school or not going to school. You have 30% of kids out of school, right? That's competition already. And so the idea is you should choose finance as an instrument to increase the competitiveness that people face. The only way to get schools to improve, or anyone to improve, including tenured professors, is to have them face competition. That's it, right? But I'm saying there's multiple. We often think of competition through markets. That's not true. There's lots of ways to get competition going. And once you have competition going, then the hunger comes up. The innovation comes up. the desire to offer. There's not a variety in education. Look, for those of you who have kids, how many of you have sent your kids to a school only and relied on that? Show of hands. You've only relied on the school to educate your child or niece or nephew or grandson. Anyone? Only relied on schools. That's amazing, right? We talk about schools. None of you have only relied on schools because you rely on extra services that you provide your children and your nieces and nephew and grandchildren. You give them extracurricular. If you're in the US, it's crazy, right? Because we do most stuff outside of school. If you ever want to see a crazy American, go see a soccer junior league game. None of these guys are going to be messy. And yet you see these 7-year-olds competing with another 8-year-old as if it's the end of the world. Why? Because we want our kids to learn non-cognitive skills, actually. These kids are never going to be soccer stars, but they know how to do team competition, in theory. They know how to be fair in theory, right? I mean, some parents get really nuts, and I think half the time I feel like the coaches have to measure the parents, not the kids. The kids are fine. It's the parents. I've actually seen one parent who basically, kid dropped and the other kid stopped on the opposition team because the kid had fallen to pick him up. And the parents shouted and said, basically, you idiot, you should have scored a goal. I'm like, great team building, But the reason I mention this is because we have all these additional services, that means you need to think of education not just as schooling, but education as something which happens all the time. It happens in your homes, it happens in your schools, it happens in after-school activities. And when we think of inadequate access, if we make the mistake in saying, hey, let's have the poor afford schooling, that's nothing. The poor have to afford the ability to do these extracurricular things. Because guess what? That's what gets you into Harvard. Your GPA doesn't get into Harvard. You have to tell some story about how you saved 50 kids in some Amazonian forest or whatever, right? Some version of that. Sorry, I tend to be very blunt. But you have to contribute in a way that makes you special. And I actually think, I have a deep belief, I have no evidence for this. A lot of the work I do is data-driven. Let me say something which is no data to it. I think every single child is born with a special ability. They have a beautiful thing inside them. I think most kids in the world never discover it. No one tells them. They never see it. And if you're lucky to see it, a lot of people never get to use it. And I think the standard we should put ourselves is how do we create a competitive setting in the learning environment, in school, out of school, that we have kids discover their innate ability and get to use it.
Thank you so much. I think we need to work on how to create that competitive setting. And next time, if I apply to Harvard again, I'll put empathy. Asim Khwaja says, that's all I need for getting into Harvard. And now I'm going to ask a question for you, Patrick. One of Venezuela's most internationally recognized educational institutions is El Sistema. Its youth receive instrumental training in classical music, but also in traditional genres. Training includes group and individual practice and regular group performances. You studied El Sistema with Inter-American Bank colleagues using a randomized control trial. It is celebrated worldwide and has been one of the country's most successful exports in the last few decades. Your RCT found that its real effects were on self-control and behavior, not academic skills, and were strongest precisely for the most vulnerable children the program was struggling to reach in the first place. Looking back on that experience of El Sistema, are there wider lessons that seem relevant for the education finance proposals we've just heard from Callysta today?
I hope so. So I worked on this evaluation with a really big team of excellent international and Venezuelan colleagues in, well, let's just say it overlapped with the death of Chavez. So it was an interesting environment in which to conduct a randomized controlled trial. And I do think there are some lessons. I mean, the first thing is that Venezuela can create education systems of international renown because this is a popular education export. And so whether we think that the salvation for children lies in an orchestra or not, certainly it didn't for me, I think we need to look hard and see if there are interesting lessons for this broader discussion of creating a high-quality system of education that's supported by a strong system of education finance. And so we did an RCT, we did lottery admissions to these nucleos, which are like schools, often based in an after-school setting. And we worked with many nucleo directors who are excellent people, some of the best principals I've met in my life, many of them products of the same educational system, so they received their training there. And we did an RCT with their cooperation. We measured a battery of skills, not just test scores, not just cognitive skills, but a range of socio-emotional skills, which is a theme that many of us have heard about today. And indeed, we did find some encouraging evidence. Interestingly enough, the strongest evidence was for boys who had been exposed to violence. And even in 2012, at least 2/3 of the sample of boys in our sample had been exposed to violence of a relatively serious sort. So there was a quite vulnerable population. And there were strong effects of participation in these orchestras, which involved both individual, group practice, hopefully not whacking each other on the head with bows or anything like that, like the soccer example. But we had a strong theory, as many do, that these orchestras might not affect test scores per se, but that they might affect learning eventually via their effects on children's socio-emotional skills, such as their ability to work in a team, to regulate their behavior, to avoid behavioral difficulties. And that's what we found for some of these vulnerable populations. But I wanted to talk just a few lessons, not about do el sistema, do more, but lessons that we might look at this experience of evaluation and maybe project onto a system of school finance with larger goals. And the first is that targeting and retention really matter a lot. I want to say we found these biggest effects for these vulnerable kids, but those were also the kids most at risk of dropping out of El Sistema. And I know we've all seen documentaries about El Sistema, and I know you cried when you saw them. I did too. Okay, no, it's a very touching thing to see children in a situation like this that are so vulnerable, and yet they were the ones that were most likely to drop out despite a putatively free system. But the problem is, if the price is equal to zero, it's not free. Okay, and so many of these kids had enormous challenges that led them to drop out, that led them to disengage from El Sistema. And at the end of the day, in many nucleos that we measured, it wasn't a poverty-targeted program. Punto. It was a middle-class program. A very effective one, an interesting one, but that missed some of the kids with whom it hoped to engage the most. So here we have a really well thought out system that's not a voucher per se. No, I don't love the V word. It's not a demand side voucher. It's a subsidy on the supply side to schools, right? And so you're paying schools transparently for the kids. Maybe you're paying them more, 40% more, lo que sea. You're paying them more to get, so that they have incentives to accept those kids. But selection and retention doesn't just work on the supply side of schools. It works on the demand side of very poor, vulnerable families. And these are lessons we know. And there are ways to address that. We're going to have an arm wrestling match about conditional cash transfers now. But no, I mean, we have a tremendous body of high quality evidence in Latin America on many ways, including conditional in-kind transfers, school meals, or cash, or unconditional cash, but many ways that we need to think creatively, also in the context of the system about how to engage kids in these well-funded, adequately funded schools, despite the hunger and the poverty that they face and the violence that they face in their households. And we have a golden opportunity here, because in Latin America, maybe we can, in the Inter-American Bank, social protection often exists in a different office than education. Sometimes they work at cross purposes. They're in 3 different ministerios. And and they use the same data, but they don't. And so the great failing of conditional cash transfers is that they don't monitor the conditions because they don't have the data on kids' attendance because we didn't focus on the EMIS. I love that acronym, right? So we have a golden opportunity here to think more creatively outside the box about social protection integrated with a system of school finance in a very creative way. And that's what I think about when I read my evaluation on El Sistema. I have one more point. Yeah, okay, I'm allowed. And that is, look, no one thinks that a schooling system should be 1,000 schools end of day fighting it out with each other. There's an optimal balance between the central and the local. And that's a hard balance to make in markets where people do what they want and pursue private gains. But I think El Sistema shows that you can balance high-quality, centralized management that sets standards and enforces accountability, but with very flexible, interesting local implementation. You have local principals with a well-known set of compositions and arrangements of increasing difficulty, but they're maneuvering at a local level in very creative ways given their local conditions. And I think it's admirable to look and see how a tension between central and local has been resolved in a setting that is Venezuelan, that may offer lessons for a difficult tightrope that you're walking with a voucher subsidy type school finance system.
Thank you so much. Now we'll open up for Q&A. We'll take 2 to 3 questions max, and please end with a question mark because we only have 8 minutes. We can start there. And we'll take all the questions at the same time.
Thank you for the conversation. I'm Felipe Vergara. I'm Chilean, so I know what you're talking about vouchers. And after 30 years, I agree with you that it's actually a system that is providing a lot of good things. That being said, there have been some struggles in these 30 years, considering that some private companies or specific people have been trying to take advantage of the system. So Chile has been providing different rules and systems. It's not designing from the beginning, but like a Christmas tree, which is not always the best. Which of those lessons would you think are important to address now that we are trying to design this system from the beginning, so we don't have to face those challenges when we are in the middle of that, considering the not that good incentives that this could create for some people to take advantage of these type of systems?
We'll take another question. I think there was one here. Yeah.
Well, it's an honor for you guys, your talks. I'm going to go straight to the thoughts. There is a region in Caracas called La Vega, es un barrio. So there is an interesting data that was collected that students were not going to school for a variety of reasons that were discussed today. But interesting, teachers that didn't want to stay in the public system, they just do the requirement. They actually created these micro schools at their homes. And there's a lot of students in these, settings. And we found a lot. And that's when the actually educations are happening. Because all the craziness, I would say, that happened during the big settings. I believe, obviously, they have to have the public. So all the variety needs to exist in order to try all different choices to find the kids' gift. So my question to you for the voucher program, how do you will envision starting voucher into the micro schools in the beginning? In the beginning for, basically what is the definition of micro school by other, countries? So basically a teacher that is creating a school on their house. And of course they need to be a safe house and the roof is not going to fall into somebody's head. And the other portion is homeschooling, because homeschooling is occurring in Venezuela informally. We have spoken with families that are being jailed for doing homeschooling. So they take their kid just to pretend to the school, just to the minimum, and then they do homeschooling. But when do you think the voucher could be for the families that are choosing, especially in this moment of transition, then a lot of things are happening for those teachers, entrepreneurs, and say, you know what, I'm going to start my business and here, and then when do you think that will be opportunity for you, for your thoughts to it, and for homeschooling as well? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to take those two questions. Do you want to start with how do we take vouchers to micro schools and homeschooling?
That's an excellent question. The world over, this is happening. Pakistan has schools which look like corner grocery stores, usually in people's houses, what you call in micro schools. It's happening everywhere. I think, private school penetration is like anywhere from 50 to 30%, depending on where you're looking. Pakistan is like 40%, 40 to 50%. Actually, I think Pakistan has done the best out of any country in the world in terms of education outcomes. Jishnu and I are writing something on this as well. Actually, better than Singapore and Finland or whatever you guys keep talking about. So let me say one thing about that. So I'm a huge believer in accommodating these schools for another reason, by the way. These schools are also a massive source of labor market participation. You have skilled, often women, who may be constrained because of care economy reasons to be at home. And I think allowing them to actually have schools set up and be recognized and supported is a huge game changer to get women back into the workforce, right? It also they're very dedicated teachers because they're doing it some mix of love, some mix of this is the only thing I can do. In fact, if you think of the study of US in 1800s in Massachusetts, the reason US schools did really well is because they took advantage of women who couldn't do anything, skilled women, except teach. And that's happening in lots of environments as well. So take advantage. There's another aspect of that. I think what you should do is, I don't think as you figured out probably, I'm against grants, I'm against vouchers, all of these things. Money should have a cost. I'm for loans. Give loans. If you're an entrepreneur, you should be able to take a loan and pay it back. If you need a grant, you're not an entrepreneur. You shouldn't be in the business, right? You should do what we call market making. What I find these schools is they actually need loans. If you can give them decent loans at affordable prices, you can scale that up, by the way, because you can't scale grants up. You can scale loans. We see rates of return to capital in schools on the order of 15 to 20%. The second thing you want to do is give them educational resources. They need teaching materials, they need access to technology, they need physical supplies, they need chairs and desks, create marketplaces where they can go and buy this stuff. That's all you need.
Patrick, do you want to answer also to that question?
I'll focus on the Chile question, I think, given my research. But I think if you do vouchers, don't do it like they did it in 1981 in Chile, right? If you allow a flourishing of private schools, place zero regulations on them, guess what? It's going to socially segregate the schooling system. And this evidence is well understood, and that's why students protested, and that's why multiple waves of reform in Chile happened, and we got to the subvención preferencial with trying to diminish some of those incentives to select poor students, to not provide them with the same educational services, and that's reflected in this policy design, and that's admirable. But I think one of the most interesting things about humans is that it's hard to get them to do what you want with rules, schools too. And so despite rules about selection, even in El Sistema, it turns out, guess what? Parents queue up for the better nucleos, with the better orchestras, and nucleo directors who really care about schooling, the quality of their orchestras, want the kid that's the killer violin player. And so selection happens covertly, sometimes overtly. It happened in Chile even after it was outlawed. And so what Chile maneuvered towards was essentially a centralized choice mechanism where voucher schools existed, but part of a public system that in order to attain public funds, they needed to be tightly regulated in how they selected students and used lottery admissions. So I think those are all a series of cautionary tales, but sequencing matters again here, because do you want us to write down the most complicated choice system in the world, socially engineered, and plop it on top of Caracas? Maybe that's not the sensible solution either. So I think it's about acknowledging these trade-offs and not let perfect be the enemy of good.
Thank you. So we are out of time, but thank you so much to Patrick, to Asim, to Callysta for this panel. And we're going to the next panel now.